Robin Sears is a well-known television commentator, and for good reason. He has been a senior aide both as a consultant and as a staffer to politicians, perhaps most notably to Bob Rae when he was Premier of Ontario, but he's worked all over the world. Robin, welcome.
Good to be here, Alan.
Tough times we're in, but I think the appropriate times to talk about leadership. But let me start with the Wayback Machine. A lot of people watching may not remember Val Sears, but Val Sears, the well-known journalist, was your father, and he famously was quoted, I don't think apocryphally, as getting off the campaign bus and saying, "Let's go, gentlemen, we have a government to defeat."
The other way around, actually, Alan. They were sitting around drinking, and he was urging them to get on the campaign bus to defeat the Diefenbaker government.
Well, fair enough. Let's compromise and say he may have said it coming and going. But the serious question is, your father watched leaders intensely as a journalist for many years. You must have had many fascinating discussions around the dinner table. What did you learn from him?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, he was almost of the Thomas Carlyle big man of history thesis about the importance of leadership, as opposed to, Marx or others more teleological, huge social forces view of leadership. And so he was very, very focused on the qualities of leadership because he felt they absolutely and directly impacted the outcomes of policy. So he couldn't stand Diefenbaker, thought he was a complete fool, thought Pearson was a nice guy but didn't have the royal jelly. Had a sort of love-hate relationship with Pierre Trudeau, became more persuaded of his value later than earlier. Had a very strong love-hate relationship with Brian Mulroney, and they subsequently became friends, and he subsequently acknowledged Mulroney's achievements, although it never appeared in the Toronto Star, needless to say. I think the saddest example of what I learned about leadership from Dad was his university chum, John Turner, who he had remained friends with throughout their lives. When he was a minister, Dad was the bureau chief of the Star here in Ottawa. Dad went back to Toronto when Turner did, and they stayed in touch. And he was appalled by Turner's unsuccessful reentry and wrote that. And it became a subject of estrangement between them. But he said, "Hey, look, he's simply lost his ability to lead. He's rusty, he's out of the game. And it's sad to see."
Well, let me test all that with your father in absentia and with you. It's funny that you can't really say that a leader needs a certain pre-leadership set of skills or experiences, because Diefenbaker was a lawyer, Pearson was a tremendously successful diplomat, Trudeau was an agitator or gadfly, whatever you want to describe him as, Mulroney, the labor lawyer and president of Iron Ore Company of Canada. And then Turner, moments before your father denounced his inabilities as a leader, had been a rainmaker and a great leader at the McMillan Minch law firm. So it's translating the leadership skills. It's not necessarily an objective skill. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think as we've come into this century, we've recognized that leadership can come from very unlikely places. Malala, that delightful young woman from Pakistan who has become a symbol of courageous young women. Barack Obama, I mean, what credentials did he have apart from being, as the Republicans like to sneer, a community activist? I think the lesson is that you look for the qualities of leadership, not the credentials that might come with a leader prospect. Sometimes the credentials are quite misleading. A law degree, being a mayor of a town, and then elevating yourself to a higher level of political office don't always translate.
All right. Then there is the context of leadership, and we are in a crisis right now that the world hasn't seen in 100 years. So what are the elements of crisis leadership for you?
I think that crisis leadership is an unique subset of leadership qualities. It has some essential elements that being a successful non-crisis leader don't require. It has some aspects that require you to give up some of the traditional and popular views of what you should do as a democratic leader in a non-crisis environment. For example, crisis leadership for me involves very strong ability to express with clarity and conviction, very precise and perhaps even unpopular expectations of the community you lead. And for me, as you know, the hero in that context is Andrew Cuomo, who, you know, in terms of his credentials, was not perhaps likely to be as successful as he was. He was a somewhat bullying, associated with a very corrupt political machine in Albany, New York, machine politician. But in the crisis, the qualities that sometimes abraded in his previous role became absolutely powerful, and especially in contrast to you know who in Washington. For example, I think the first thing he did was to acknowledge it was his responsibility. He was going to be personally accountable for anything that went wrong. And he would repeat that again and again, following one of the basic dictates of communications discipline, as we both know, Alan. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Secondly, and related, that he would never ask the citizens of New York to do anything that he personally was not going to impose on himself in his life and his private behavior. And he would frequently bring his daughter to press conferences and say, you know, we've been let out of the house for the first time in 2 weeks together as a way of making light of the pain and suffering. I think the second thing is that you have to demonstrate competence and confidence. Every day he would appear with endless charts and graphs and stats and public officials on either side of him, giving the foundational evidence for what he was asking people to do very painfully in some cases. And in the face of, we should come back to this later in terms of what our present circumstance is, in the face of not very obvious success on the ground, you know, ambulances screaming every 2 minutes through the streets of Brooklyn 24/7. After you'd heard these encouraging words from your governor earlier in the day, was a bit of a contrast. And finally, I think he did something especially clever to my mind, and that was he made it clear that the degree to which this would work was his ability to persuade, through his authenticity and his conviction, the people of New York to do what had to be done. And he said at the beginning and then later towards the end, my greatest nightmare, I would ask the people of New York to shut themselves in, to do all of the things that were required for us to get this epidemic under control. And they might say, you're being political, Governor. We're not going to do that. What was I going to do? Arrest 19 million New Yorkers? It was an existential nightmare, literally, for him. But he paired it with a paradoxical conundrum, which made it even more powerful as an expression of leadership challenge. He said, then I had to turn around to all the essential workers in the state and say, but you're going to work every day, and you're going to take care of our people, and we're going to take care of you. My second nightmare was, what if they said, what? We're the victims, and those people are the ones we're protecting? Go to hell, we're not going to do that. But they showed up. Those together created a combination of crisis leadership style, which I think is for the textbook.
Fair enough. And even if you're a military leader, you can't be assured that your troops will do exactly what they're commanded to do. There are many examples of them not doing it. But let me give you a ball of wool here and get you to unravel it, because there is a short hop between the confidence of Cuomo and the confidence of Donald Trump, which seems, I think many people would say, to veer into arrogance. There are also the facts on the ground. The hardest hit jurisdiction in America is New York State. Cuomo somehow is coming out with a better reputation, and Donald Trump is coming out with a poor reputation in the same country. And Governor Cuomo is the head of that jurisdiction that's been so hard hit. In Canada, I believe Quebec is the hardest hit jurisdiction in the world per capita. No one is blaming the premier, and no one is blaming Justin Trudeau. So, a short hop across the international border, we have vastly different public reactions to these situations. What do you make of all that?
Well, I think that's the cruel reality for the leaders. You can be doing everything right. You can be being absolutely clear and executing well, and still go sideways on you. This has happened to Gavin Newsom in California this month, sadly. You can not be doing everything right, but for reasons of solidarity among your citizens and the quality of your essential workers, things go well and you get the credit. It would be hard to argue that Premier Legault deserves much of his popularity on the strength of execution. I mean, they have had the highest number of deaths in nursing homes per capita of any jurisdiction in the world. So the painful aspect of this is you can be a great crisis leader and fail. You can be a terrible crisis leader and be seen to be a success.
So you would know, being so well read, who the British politician was. I can't remember the name, but cautioning one of his predecessors to say, just be careful of,
Harold Macmillan.
Events, young man. That's what's going to scupper you.
Yeah, no, as the young man comes up to the great statesman at a lunch and says, "What worries you most, Prime Minister?" And he looks down and wags his finger. Yeah, it's a great line and sums up our truth.
A dear friend of mine was manager of communication for Exxon, and he had nothing to do with the first oil embargo in the 70s, but he got all the blame. He had almost nothing to do with the change of the name from Esso to Exxon, involving, a worldwide search as to whether it meant something naughty in a foreign language or something. He simply pushed a button, made it happen, and he got enormous credit. So his dictum was, take all the credit you can get because you're going to get all the blame you don't deserve.
I think your point about military leadership is really worth focusing on a little bit, Alan, because, military leaders are trained to be successful in crisis continually. And, what we know about leadership is that we don't know very much. General Wesley Clark, who I interviewed a few times and respected enormously as a military leader, summed it up in a lovely aphorism. He said, in the U.S. Army, it takes an average of 23 years for us to feel that you are qualified to be a senior leader. That's the typical career range between day one and being a 3-star general. But if you're a 23-year-old lieutenant, we expect you to show leadership on the field the day you arrive. And that's, obviously an impossible combination on a rational level, but it does, in fact, reveal, I think, the truth of leadership, which is that there are some non-objective, non-predictable qualities about it that emerge in unlikely places. I became very good friends with a guy named Ron Tucker, who was the commander of the USS Independence Battle Fleet during the Vietnam War. He was my next door neighbor in Hong Kong. And one day we were riding the bus down to work together, and he said, "Robin, I bet like most of your generation, you have the same view of military leadership as you do of military justice or martial music." And I sort of blushed and tried not to acknowledge. And he said, "Yeah, I thought so. Well, let me tell you something. When you're the commander of an aircraft carrier and you have 5,000 testosterone-poisoned, heavily armed young men under your command, and you get up on the bridge and you speak to them as they're arrayed in front of you on the deck, and you tell them they have to put their lives in your hands, they have another option." And I thought, geez, I never thought of that. That the ability to cohere and convene and convince people in a large body who have a lot of other choices than listening or obeying you, even if you're in the Army, is the real test of leadership.
Well, you've taken us into one of my favorite topics, forgive me, and that is the famous military expression attributed to von Clausewitz, the fog of battle. Now, he wrote so much, nobody knows if he ever actually used those words, but he used the words fog and friction, meaning the things you don't know. It could be the weather, it could be the black smoke on an 18th century battlefield. It could be material breaking down or soldiers breaking down. You never hear that phrase in government or industry. The captains of industry put on a blue suit and assume that there is no fog or friction. And that's a huge mistake, it seems to me.
I mean, again, my friend Admiral Tucker used to say, because he was then the head of Bechtel in Asia and I was a headhunter, and we would talk about leadership issues on the bus in the morning. He'd say, Robin, do you think that there are many CEOs who understand that management is not the same as leadership? And I would say, no, I think there are not very many of those. And that's the reason that so many companies and so many CEOs get into such trouble. I think that what we're seeing in this pandemic is some corporate leaders get it, that they have to step up and be crisis leaders too. The vast majority don't.
I'm glad you've dragged us back into the pandemic, because as good as Governor Newsom in California has done, as good as Rob Ford has done with a Canadian version of populism, and as good as Governor Cuomo has done, we're getting into very, very bad numbers in many American states. And the question is, how do you recover from the double whammy or the second wave within the first wave, let alone whatever's going to happen in the fall?
No, I think that's precisely the moment we are in this week, the days after the July 4th fiasco of public irresponsibility in too many places, not only in the US, in Western Europe as well. Because it's, to me, the equivalent of late 1940, early 41 in the UK, where Churchill had come out a year prior very powerfully, very compellingly, but the facts on the ground were getting worse, not better. And there was a temptation, there is always a temptation, as you see from Trump and Pence today, to make happy talk when things are going bad, to pretend that they're not as bad as you think, or that it's been claimed, and anyway, they'll be over soon and get better. That's, in my view, almost always a mistake, because you're setting expectations that you have no ability to influence or fulfill. What you should do is what Churchill did with his darkest hour speeches. You acknowledge how bad it is. You acknowledge how frustrated you are. You take responsibility for the failures, and you explain how and with what tools you're going to lead the country back into a better place, despite the trough you're in today.
But with the caveat that Laurier was known for sunny ways, and FDR was known for saying there's nothing to fear but fear itself in the darkest hours. And at least certainly FDR has gone down in history as having this sunny personality, and that's what helped so much in a crisis.
Yeah, but it was never magical thinking. It was never phony happy talk. It was always serious leadership, even if he was optimistic in his assessment of the outcome. There's a difference between that idiot Pence getting up and saying, you know, that the worst is behind us. No one has done better than we've done. Or Trump saying on the weekend, 99% of coronavirus cases are relatively harmless. I mean, apart from anything else, they're insulting. They don't persuade anyone except the dimmest bulb in the room that you're telling them the truth. And so they're offensive.
Commentators like you, I'm not necessarily quoting you directly, but you've been observing for the past 50 years that government has fewer levers to pull, whether you're a civil servant or an elected official, and that corporations are pulling more of the levers with new public management and outsourcing and all kinds of other things which are off topic. I'm given to believe that governments in North America, subnational and national governments, have no more borrowing power. They have no more money. They don't have very many levers left, especially if there's a second wave in the fall. So what do you do other than make happy talk speeches?
I'm not sure I agree with that thesis, Alan. I mean, I think that it is the conventional wisdom on either side of the public-private sector divide, which is particularly wide in Canada. But you know, Andrew Cuomo, again, sent the National Guard into private hospitals and seized their private property. Took hundreds of ventilators out of hospitals that, in the judgment of health officials, didn't need them, and took them to where they were desperately needed. That's an expression of governmental power over the corporate sector in a crisis that was a little bit breathtaking. You could almost see a CEO saying, "You can't steal my goddamn ventilators just because you're the governor." And by the same token, I don't think that governments call on the corporate sector leadership sufficiently to make demands of them. Brian Mulroney, who, as you know, I worked with when he was in some difficulties, and we were on the opposite side of this fight in the free trade era. But I was contrasting the free trade era and the role of the private sector and our efforts to renegotiate NAFTA more recently and what private sector leaders had done. And he said, Robin, I was on the phone every day to a dozen guys saying, you will do this for me today, and I'll be calling you this afternoon to see how it went. And then the staff would call, and then he would call back. I mean, he used that role in the way that Andrew Cuomo is using his role to extend the levers of power of government in a way you couldn't get away with in other than a crisis environment. But in a crisis environment, I think government leaders can do a hell of a lot more to bring others to the table than they do.
Well, I've joked that with the possible exception of Lyndon Johnson, Brian Mulroney practically invented making phone calls. I guess John Turner made his share. But still, though, one more time at the fewer levers question, you have to pay the National Guard. There have to be orders for ventilators, and those accounts have to be paid. And governments seem to be losing some of their abilities to take these actions, even if you have the will to take action. So astral project yourself into the fall. What do you do in trying to close back down what measures of the economy opened up after people have been out in public protests on race issues, on opening up the economy issues, and those who didn't die are saying, there you are. How do you enforce a lockdown after people have scoffed at the first one?
Well, let me deal with the fiscal side first on. I think one of the lessons of this pandemic is that we have been very foolish in our acceptance of a basically monetarist thesis going back to the 70s and 80s about the importance of fiscal balance for governments. As Kevin Page, who I respect enormously, Canada's first parliamentary budget officer, said, we are probably going to double the global public sector debt levels in the first half of this year, from 20 to 40 trillion dollars. And I said, well, Kevin, trees don't grow to the sky. How high can they go? He said, we don't know. But every estimate we have made about what the threshold of pain is has been proven wrong. The Chinese are now at about 200% debt to GDP. The Japanese are over 250%. And there's no run on the banks. There's no collapse of their economy. So I think we have to go back to the time of the First World War, really, or maybe even the Napoleonic Wars, when governments borrowed 2 to 3 times the national GDP to fight a war, and then spent a generation paying it off, except in the French case where they defaulted on all of the creditors 3 times. But it's a very elastic moment in fiscal theory right now about where the boundaries are and how do you set them. And as, again, I keep going back to Cuomo said bitterly at one point, I don't have a goddamn massive printing press in my basement that can print dollar bills. Donald Trump does. The ability of those governments with strong currencies to simply issue new currency and new debt with a keystroke is something we've never really contemplated the margins of.
All right, well, let's get way out on the edges of this fiscal issue. And I'll postulate this. If everybody owes everybody lots and lots of money in the world, does anybody really owe anybody anything?
You put your finger on one of the essential ingredients in the stew, according to Page, which is, who do you owe the money to? In Canada, more than 60% of the money is owed to Canadians. In China, it's 90%. Chinese government to Chinese people. Then you're in a good situation. If I owe you money and you're an American, I'm in a very bad situation. But there's that old aphorism, you owe the bank $10,000, you got a problem. You owe the bank $10 million, they got a problem. There are limits to the degree to which the creditors can impose any limits on government's borrowing and spending if everybody's doing it.
Well, and then there are those levers that aren't fiscal, such as the 4-day work week, flex time, job sharing, office hoteling, working from home, educational, maternity, paternity, eternity leave, all the kinds of things, forgive me, that weren't really on the table during the Ray Day era when you were working for Bob Ray. I'm not seeing much creativity in public administration these days, are you?
I think that may be a little harsh, Alan. I mean, you know, in the Ray days, for example, that government tried very hard to impose employment equity, which was hugely resisted, hugely controversial, and probably contributed to their defeat because it was seen as the government trying to dictate to the private sector who they could hire, who they had to promote, and what they had to pay them. Today, it's almost conventional. I mean, today, there wouldn't be any resistance to that notion, even among conservatives. I think what we are about to see is the test of public sector creativity. I think that the next quarter is what's going to show whether they have the ability to rebuild in a reimagined way or simply flip back to old patterns. Some people have shown already, I think, some considerable courage. For example, I think that the decision of the Danes to transition slowly and with some caution, obviously, they're Scandinavian, from their emergency cash payments to their people to a limited form of basic universal income or guaranteed annual income. Well, that's an idea that my friend Hugh Segal has been promoting for 60 years without success. There will be some recidivism, and I think there will be some creativity. For the Trudeau government, the big challenge is going to be green versus jobs. And I wouldn't want to bet any money on how that's going to turn out.
All right, leadership in a crisis. Robin Sears, people may forget because it's been a while that you started out as a journalist at City TV and have conducted lots and lots of interviews. So I've got to defer to you and say, what was the question that I may have not asked you that I should have, or the follow-up question that you'd like to ask yourself? You're on.
Well, I didn't answer the second part of your question earlier about what do you do if in the second wave you have a lot of people saying, hell with that, I'm not going to do that anymore. And how does the government respond to that? And to me, that is going to be the next Mount Everest test of leadership in the democratic world. Because it's going to require the leaders to somehow persuade their citizenry of the essentiality of accepting limitations in their lives again and accepting the imposition of some penalties if they don't. That's going to be a very tough test of leadership this fall.
Well, let's do this again and see what happens and what your thoughts are.
Look forward to it, Al.
Thank you.
Thank you.